Cool. I think we can get started. So good morning to everyone, and welcome to another installment of iTOOsday. This morning we are joined by David. David has a very long resume, so I'm not going to try to read everything because he's very well accomplished, and I'm sure he'll do a better job at introducing himself. But David specializes in insurance litigation and construction and infrastructure law. His experience in insurance litigation includes public liability claims, PI claims, and construction industry related claims. David also provides claims teams with input regarding policy response to claims made and assists with the drafting of representations to internal claims arbitrations and the Ombud. David advises clients on the drafting of and enforcement of building industry specific contracts, and he's also experienced in negotiation and drafting of JBCC, NEC3, GCC, and FIDIC agreements. David has vast experience in occupational health and safety in the built environment and has been involved in the collapse inquiries such as Tongaat Mall and the Greyston Drive bridge collapse. David, you've got a lot of experience, and often claims is the best place to learn about what the actual policies covered. So we are very excited to have you on the call today and looking forward to learning lots from you. So over to you, Dave.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Welcome from a rather grey and cold Durban. I know our cold isn't the same as Joburg cold. I've got an office up there as well, and Joburg cold is a different level of cold. You guys do everything bigger and better than we do. We're a little bit slow on that side. So just to come in from where I'm speaking from, I come from a building and construction industry background. My family's been in the industry for decades, grew up in a family construction and engineering business, spent every minute of my waking life on a construction site. So it's sort of in my blood. You can imagine when I was 17 and I said to my father at the time, I want to become a lawyer, there was silence at the dinner table for about 4 months. I don't think anyone could really accept the fact that I wasn't going to become an engineer, because that's sort of what my grandfather did, my father did, it's my brother did, my sister did. It's just in our family. The reason I wanted to become a lawyer is because it dawned on me at that early age that a lot of the difficulties we were having on the construction sites and as a family business was because we just didn't understand the contracts. We didn't understand the built environment complexities surrounding legalities and insurance. And we actually needed someone in the family to go out there, learn that skill so that they could come back and actually deal with it. Well, that is how I explained it and sort of wangled my way back onto the will. I say that, of course, tongue in cheek. So this is where I am now, and I've only ever done construction law. I don't understand divorce or RAF claims or crash and bash stuff. It's just not what I've done. I was very fortunate to start my career at a small law firm in Johannesburg called Denise Rates, as it was back then. We had an office in Maud Street. It was the largest firm in South Africa at the time. I think we had 150 partners. And then, of course, that then carried on. I was very fortunate to work with some of, in my view, the brightest minds of the time. And this is where I've ended up. So I give these types of talks regularly to both the construction industry and to the insurance industry, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. So I've been knocking on this door for a little while, saying very happy to talk. So I'm very glad that I'm finally able to give you guys some feedback and just explain how we see things from a construction industry point of view and how it affects the insurance industry and vice versa. So the talk today is on defects and damage. Now, there is no golden bullet. You're not going to walk away today with a very simple explanation of what the one is and what the other is. It can be quite murky. It can be quite difficult to identify the difference or one or the other. The reason I'm giving this talk quite a lot at the moment is quite simply because there seems to be a trend in the industry at the moment where claims are being delivered, they're being made, and the claim is for damage. When it gets brought to me and gets shown to me, I then look at it and I say, well, why isn't that a construction defect? Of course, I say this because I then look at reports, I then look at tests, and for me, applying just general industry practice, it appears to me that there's an underlying defect. And in fact, the approximate cause of the loss is a defect. But because I don't have a PhD in engineering, it then goes off to an expert who either says I'm talking nonsense or confirms what I'm saying. A huge part of this comes in materials, especially concrete and asphalt, or sub-base layers, sometimes a cementized base layer, like a C5 mix or something like that. So what you will see is there's rutting, or examples as rutting, cold joints, and honeycombing. Now, are those a damage? Are those a defect? What is the underlying cause of the rutting, the cold joint, the honeycombing? That requires investigation. It requires some expert input. It requires a lot of factual investigation as well. And then 99% of the time require chronology and a timeline to be established so you can get to the bottom of whether it's a defect or a damage. And then, of course, why is this important to the industry as a whole? Because normally, to some extent, loss caused by defective workmanship or design is expressly excluded by policy wording. The problem we have is wordings and defect exclusions do vary remarkably, and the subtle differences in that drafting can have a dramatic effect. Okay, so that is why we're here, and it's just important to understand that these are not simple things. We're going to go through some examples today and just try and leave you with some principles, some understanding, and just things to look at in the future when a claim comes past your desk. If you're in the claims department, if you're in underwriting, maybe some principles to think about the next time you're drafting a clause. If you are a broker, because I don't know who's on the line, just things to think about when you are drafting a claim, providing advance cover, or advising an insured as to whether there's cover or not. So these are important things and things to look at. So as a starting point, so I'm not first language English. My surname gives that away. So I always start off as simply as possible. So what is a defect? It's a shortcoming, imperfection, or a lack. So if you just look at the general definition from the dictionary, it's a shortcoming, imperfection, or a lack. Very broad, very imprecise. So we need more assistance. Okay, so what's probably the leading case in South Africa on defects? It's probably Holmdene Brickworks versus Roberts Construction. Now, in this case, it's quite simple. Roberts Construction, we've all heard of Murray and Roberts. Well, this is before Murray was involved. So Roberts Construction Building Company, we all know they're a building company. They were employed to build a structure. What they needed to do was they needed bricks. They then went off to Holmdene Brickworks and they concluded a supply contract with Holmdene Brickworks. They received their bricks from Holmdene and they built the wall. Shortly after construction was completed, the bricks began to crumble and decompose. Okay, it's a condition called efflorescence. Effectively, what it did is it threatened the stability of the entire structure. As you can imagine, when bricks start to decay and decompose, you lose the structural integrity of what's been constructed. So it was a huge problem. The affected walls had to be demolished, and then of course Murray and Roberts, or Roberts Construction back then, sued for damages arising from the breach of contract because there was this underlying supply contract. So as you can imagine, Corbett J.A., as he was then, had to then look at the underlying contract, had to look at the bricks supplied, had to look at what the conditions were, what the parties knew when they entered into the contract, and this is what he had to say. So he says, broadly speaking, in this context, a defect may be described as an abnormal quality or attribute which destroys or substantially impairs the utility or effectiveness of the res vendita. That just means the thing purchased for the purpose for which it has been sold or which it is commonly used. Such a defect is latent when It is one which is not visible or discoverable upon an inspection of the res vendita. So basically, when you buy the brick, was it visible or discoverable upon inspection? So you have a large pallet of bricks. I don't know if you've ever had bricks delivered to your home. They arrive on a wooden pallet. They arrive stacked probably a meter high by a meter wide. They are wrapped in a very thick plastic. You cut the plastic open, you count how many high, how many wide, because you do a simple calculation of how many are in the box, and you have a general look at them. You don't get to see the bricks in the middle, you get to see the bricks on the outside, and you just have a general look. So was the defect in the bricks which caused the issue in the decay, was it readily visible? Could you pick it up? But what's important is the description of a defect. It's an abnormal quality or attribute which destroys, substantially impairs the utility or effectiveness of the thing. Okay, so it's a quality or attribute in the thing, and it's got to be an abnormal quality or attribute. Okay, so this is important. So and you'll see when we start talking about what a damage is, you'll start to see how the approach is different. Okay, so our first example or study is AMEC Civil Engineering versus Norwich Union Insurance. A very, very interesting case. So in July 93, AMEC was appointed as a contractor to carry out the reclamation works in Jersey. As part of these works, AMEC was required to construct a seawall from reinforced concrete blocks. So huge project, complicated project. AMEC knew what they were doing. Now, specification required the concrete to cover the reinforcing steel by 75 millimeters. A specification like that is critical when it comes to, as you can imagine, salt sea water and steel. That's called coverage when it comes to concrete. And that specification would have been monitored very, very, very closely by the resident engineer. The blocks were cast in a mold at a precast yard and progressively incorporated into the seawall. During the course of the progress of the construction seawall, random checks were carried out at the precast yard, which showed that the concrete cover over the reinforcement in some of the blocks was less than 75 millimeters. In May 94, so approximately a year later, 6 of the installed blocks showed signs of rusting. Okay, so one assumes that the second coverage of less than 75 millimeters was picked up. Those blocks would have been rejected. Okay, May 1994, 617 blocks were manufactured and 348 blocks had been installed. The 348 blocks installed were tested, and a large number had concrete lower than the specified 75 millimeters. It begs the question, why were they installed? But the story goes on. 104 blocks were identified as having less than 50 meters of coverage, and Jersey required AMEC to replace these 104 blocks. This included 3 of the blocks which showed signs of rusting. It was not in dispute that the cause of the lack of the specified concrete cover was that the reinforcement cage had moved during the casting process. So what effectively happens when you pour concrete? You traditionally have fixed steel in the structure you are pouring. When you pour the concrete, depending on the stiffness, the slump, and those types of things, the steel, if it's not fixed properly or adequately, can move or can shift. A proper steel fixing inspection should avoid that, but that's what happened in this matter. So be it. AMEC sought to claim on its insurance policy for the cost of replacing the 104 blocks. The insurance policy covered loss of or damage to the insured property arising from any cause whatsoever, except as herein provided. Okay, so quite wide wording. Exclusion 3 reads loss of or damage to, and the costs necessary to replace, repair, or rectify that part of the permanent works which is in a defective condition due to negligent design, plan, specification, materials, or workmanship. And that's exclusion 3. Not surprisingly, the insurers relied on exclusion 3. The insurer's argument was that the blocks were not damaged or lost, they were simply badly built. But now, why are they badly built? They're badly built because there is a contractual specification of concrete coverage of 75 mils. When tested, there is insufficient coverage. The contractor's answer is, oh, but the steel reinforcing inside the concrete block has moved. That's led to this. I'm suffering a damage because I've got to damage the works that I've already completed to replace this defective thing. So just shows you how complicated it can be and how far you have to go to investigate whether it's defect, whether it's damage, whether it's defect and damage. It's not simple. That's why this type of talk is important, because it gets you thinking and it gets you curious, or hopefully it does. Okay. Seymour J, the judge at the time, found against AMEC. This is what was said. In my judgment, it's quite plain on proper construction of the principal insuring clause in the policy that it did not extend to providing AMEC an indemnity in respect of the cost of replacing items manufactured by AMEC, which are defective. So, and that follows for me. Seymour J held that even if it could be said that the blocks were damaged as a result of being broken out, it was not that the damage which caused any financial loss to AMEC. AMEC's financial loss stemmed from installing defective blocks in the first place. So what is the proximate cause of the loss? The proximate cause was the poor manufacturing and the installation of that defectively manufactured block, simply put. So already, as an example, you can see how layered these investigations are and the detail with which you have to look at these things. And then Seymour J continues, however, on the assumption that there was in fact damage caused during the removal of the blocks, any financial loss was clearly caused at the point at which the need to remove the blocks subsequently arose, namely when it was incorporated in the wall. So they go back to proximate cause. When did the loss arise? Okay, very interesting judgment. What I like about the judgment is it talks about the structure and the composition of the blocks and the specification in very simple ways. And when you're dealing with concrete, especially steel reinforced concrete, it's not cement. Remember, cement is an ingredient that is used in the mixture to produce concrete. I've recently seen a loss adjusters report that talks about cement being defective. It's incorrect. So it's details like that. What did the contractor specification say? And this is why when you are running a defect or damage investigation, you have to understand the construction contract underlying the project, what the scope of works was, what the employer's requirements were, technical specifications. You need to have the ability to look at inspections, test results, progress meetings, technical meetings. You need to be able to work with those documents, understand the jargon, have your expert come out, speak to the project team. Often the insured will then keep the project team close and not necessarily give you too much access to them. That's really where you get into the nitty-gritty of it. So incredibly important. This word part floats around these defective works exclusions quite a lot. So one feature which is quite common in interpretation of defect exclusions is the need to identify a part of the insured property which is defective, causing damage to another part of the insured property. It gives us all gray hairs. It is incredibly frustrating, especially when you apply the unitary exercise of interpretation in the Indomini decision in the SCA. The second you are debating interpretation, your case is a 50-50. That is the high watermark. A lot of people will tell you your case is very strong, it just follows, it's logical. Before the Supreme Court of Appeal, nothing's logical, nothing simple, nothing follows. You have a bunch of people up there that may not read it like that at all. And you know, we've learned the hard way. We've all read recent Supreme Court of Appeal decisions, which are quite difficult to read, and sometimes don't even make sense. So we all just need to be aware of that. So often the defect itself will be excluded, but any consequential damage caused by the defect or the other parts of the works will be included. So incredibly important. But again, are the parts divisible? Are they separate? How do you look? So now you need to look at the construction methodology, you need to look at the materials, and you need to understand whether they are separate or not. So there's two great examples. Promet engineering, it's a great case to use so is Graham Evans. So part is capable of being used in a whole variety of ways depending on the context, and this is where the difficulty lies. So in the Australian case of Graham Evans versus Vanguard Insurance, very important, coats of paint were held to be damaged after it was discovered that the primer was too thin and therefore defective. The cost of damage to the top coats caused by the defective primer was held to be covered by the insurance contract. So it's the knock-on effect of the very thin primer. Remember, primer is the base coat. It's the first coat that goes onto the raw material. If the primer is too thin and then moves or fails or bubbles or cures at the incorrect rate or whatever it is, that has the knock-on effect then of destroying all the other paint layers that are subsequently put on. Well, Graham Evans versus Vanguard says, well, the policy based on that specific wording, don't forget, would then cover the subsequent damage to the upper layers.
Sorry, David.
Yo.
Can I just quickly ask a question that is not engineering related when it comes to parts or defective parts? So for example, let's say in a motor vehicle, the brake pads or the brake panel is defective, but that's not covered. But then it causes subsequent damage to the rest of the vehicle, but then that's covered. So why not cover the part that is actually, that can cause the damage? I don't ever understand why there's a separation. Maybe you can clarify.
Well, there's a separation because remember the part that is excluded has to be the part that is defective in design, workmanship, or specification. So a brake pad or brake pedal would only be excluded if the brake pad or pedal was designed inappropriately, was of a poor specification, or the workmanship carried out was defective. So again, it comes down to wording. That exclusion is there quite simply because we're not there to cover that. And we're not there to cover your poor performance. So for example, let's say you, and I love the Scancer ego argument, is let's say you put down a base layer when you're doing flooring or a road. You are not the greatest contractor. You know a road is made up of 3 to 5 layers, depending on specification, highway, coulter, whatever technicalities. You are negligent and you don't build the base layer appropriately. You use the wrong material because you're trying to cheap out. You don't use the right labor. Because you think to yourself, oh, it's the bottom layer. No one's going to see my work. No one's going to know what I've done. Then the asphalt, which is some people call tar. It's not tar, it's asphalt. The asphalt layer goes on top. It's paved on top. Now the asphalt starts failing, starts cracking, rutting. We've all driven our cars over a pothole, a rut, a crack in the road. That's there because something in the base layer has failed. That's not poor asphalting. Okay. What the way insurance policies look at that is, well, that's your poor workmanship. We don't cover you for that. We don't cover you for your inability to do your job.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, we're not going to pay you and indemnify you for that bottom layer, because you should have actually performed the works appropriately in terms of the contract as you're required to do. Your malperformance is not something we insure. And that follows. In terms of motor vehicles and that type of thing, let's say there was poor workmanship in an engine, and the engine fails, explodes, boom, and that causes other damage. For example, let's say it buckles the bonnet. The bonnet is buckled as a consequence of that motor exploding. The motor explodes due to poor workmanship. But let's say you are the plant company and you do your own maintenance. You won't be indemnified for your poor maintenance of that engine, or alternatively, your poor workmanship on the motor to overhaul it, for example. But you may be indemnified for damage to paint on the vehicle or the bonnet. You need to look at the wording of part. So, and often this comes up, for example, and I've done a number of plant claims where the front end loader or the excavator has then gotten a mind of its own, or has run away and has driven into what they're building, or has wiped out another machine, or those types of subsequent things. So That's why it's not covered. It's not covered because you are required to mitigate, you're required to perform in terms of the underlying contract. We are not there as the insurer to protect the insured from its own malperformance of a contract. That's not what we do.
Perfect. Understood. Thank you.
Cool. So the Scanson versus ego judgment is that exact example of flooring and base layers. And this is what the judge had to say. The argument attempts to divide the indivisible. I see no prospect of any court accepting that the sub-base damage damaged the rest of the slab above it. So it's quite interesting because roads and flooring are done in layers. Roads traditionally have a sub-base, a base, and a wear course. The wear course can be made up of 2 different courses or layers. I'm getting technical, but it's actually quite simple. And the performance of the wear course, the asphalt, the blacktop, depends massively on how well the sub-base layers are made. I've had a number of claims on, for some reason, car circuits or car tracks where the insured puts down faulty material or doesn't build the base layer properly and has to then tear up the asphalt, has to what they call mill out the asphalt to get to the damaged base layer. And they say, oh, well, it's as a consequence. And we've argued successfully, well, no, it's one and the same thing. In order to replace your defective works, you're going to have to tear through everything else to get there. Now, that's not our problem. That's not damage. That's you actually tearing up those works to get to your defective workmanship. We're not covering it. It's one and the same thing. It's layer works. So that's how we've argued it in the past. So just again, that word part, the defective part, a lot of the wording, it is a hazard. It is very difficult. And there is no golden rule. You could look at it on a case-by-case basis. But just remember these 2 judgments. Look at it, look at the knock-on. Is it divisible? Is it not divisible? Is it part of the larger thing? Is it a part that actually can't be separated out? So it can get quite technical, it can get quite detailed. Look at it on a case-by-case basis and look at the defective part or the defective thing that was the trigger. And is that a part of the whole, or is that not part of the whole? So for example, let's say you've put defective stone into an asphalt mix. Strictly, the defective part is the stone aggregate in the mix. However, how do you divide the stone from the bitumen, from the sand, from the binders, and say, oh, it's not actually all of the asphalt? It's one ingredient that makes up the whole. So if that's defective, everything's defective. The part, you could never divide it. It's indivisible. It's part of the whole. So that is very difficult. I completely feel for every single person that's ever started that debate about what is the part and what do we provide cover for, being the consequence. It's always a debate. It can get quite emotive. People get quite upset because they say, oh, but you're not reading the word part. It's part. And then they say, if it meant anything else, I've had this ridiculous argument thrown at me by someone in the industry. Oh, but a road doesn't have a part. If they wanted to exclude a layer, they would have said layer. I can be quite rude and direct, so I won't repeat what I said, but I gave them a very odd look, and I'll leave it there. The word part, as the courts have said, it has to be interpreted widely. It's a thing in the insured property. Okay, so the approach appears to have been adopted by the courts as a common sense approach, thank goodness. Private engineering, the court was requested to consider whether a defective part in that case, the weld, has caused damage, and this is what the judge had to say. The submission based upon the use of the word part is, in my judgment, open to objections. It leads to absurd results. It provides no criteria for distinguishing between what is and what is not damaged. The suggested criteria, what can be physically separated, what performs a separate function, are not derived from anything contained in the clause. So this is the difficulty judges have with it. So you can see even judges have a difficulty in interpreting those clauses. If they're having difficulty and they're supposed to be the sage advisors of the world, it is completely understandable that we have a similar difficulty. These are not easy things. Again, case by case, what I find works very well is you get an expert involved and you get an expert to do a simple 3-page report where they explain that either it is a part that can be separated and is distinguishable, or it is not. Again, finding experts that are competent is a debate for another day, all in itself. Okay, so as you can see from our discussion on defects, defects are quite simply described as the ghost in the machine. It is sometimes very, very difficult to pick up a defect. It can be a tiny issue. Sometimes the defect can be so patent that when you pull off the boards of a concrete pour, for example, they are clear to see. It's honeycombing, a cold joint, something like that. Sometimes the defect is so patent that when you move over the object, for example, rutting on an asphalt road, you see the rut, you feel the rut when you're in your car because your car shakes. So defects are very skilled at hiding themselves. And as a consequence, you really need someone who's either very experienced or is an expert to identify the defect and explain why it is a defect. What gets more interesting is that defect a defect in construction, a defect in design, so a defect in specification, or was it a defect in, as I said, construction, the works? And more often than not, the defect is never truly a single blame item. So it's not just design, it's not just work. More often than not, the defect will straddle that line and it'll be a bit blurry. So not easy to do. I say to everyone, just give yourself a break. Don't beat yourself up if you miss it. They are very, very easy to miss. Take a step back, but then you also need to get very, very involved in the technical. And the best loss adjusters for me in the construction industry are men and women who have been on site, have stood in the sun enough to know what should and should not have been done, and in the ordinary course, how it should have played out. What I struggle to do is give examples of things we're working on at the moment, because they are all either in litigation or confidential large claims that have gone under. But so, for example, with concrete, cold joints, honeycombing, those are very common defects in concrete. And any specification out there contractually that exists is when you pour, it's got to be a certain MPa, which is strength, and then no cold joints, no honeycombing. There's a certain finish that's required. If that finish isn't met, you haven't performed in terms of your concrete. Why? Because the works are defective. And what do you undertake to perform in terms of any construction contract, being JBCC, FIDIC, GCC, NEC 3 or 4? You undertake as a contractor to perform the works free from defect. So automatically you on a contractual breach side, and you must fix your defect. You are contractually required to repair that defect. Not repair the damage, that's a separate term in the contract. If the works that you have performed are damaged, whilst you still have, they're still in your care and possession, you must repair that damage at your own cost as well, because you have risk in the works. So every construction contract in the world deals with defects and deals with damage to the works. The works are what you are building and becomes permanent at the end of the day. Your defect can be in the temporary works or the permanent works. So it's incredibly important that we understand the underlying construction contract. It'll be one of the big four or one of these terrible bespoke things floating around the industry that just don't make sense. But people are making lots of money out of drafting them. So eluta continua, that sort of seems to be the case. And what's very interesting is we need to understand from the underlying construction contract, if there is one, hopefully there is, what the position is regarding defects and what the position is regarding damage. Who has contractual responsibility? Then what's important to find out is, has the engineer, the principal agent, or the employer's representative on site, the party on site, has there been an investigation into what's caused the damage or defect? Has there been an investigation into again, what is the cause or the proximate cause, and who is responsible? Has the engineer, the principal agent, or someone like that issued a contractual instruction or a site memo or a site instruction regarding its repair, the cost, and the works that need to take place? Critically important, because more often than not, an engineer will write to the main contractor, which is more often than not your client, and say to the contractor, there is a defect, there's honeycombing on all of this concrete, you must go and repair it. It is a defect. So for example, in terms of Vlcek, it's clause 7.5, I've identified a defect, there's a defect in your works, the finish has to be an off shutterboard finish, free from honeycombing. This is the look we're going for. There's honeycombing all over, go and repair. I have seen hundreds of times an insured literally take that engineer's instruction, give it to their broker. The broker has filled out a claim form and they said the concrete structure that has been poured is damaged. We would like you to indemnify us, please. Just ask for the engineer's instruction. The engineers described it and identified it as a defect. You just ask the insured, have you challenged that instruction? Have you taken that instruction to dispute, to adjudication, to arbitration? Have you issued a notice of dissatisfaction? What have you done if you don't agree with it? 99.99999% of the time, the contractor insured will say, oh, we've done nothing. So you've done nothing, but you disagree with it, but now you've come to us seeking an indemnity. It doesn't follow. It doesn't follow because they know they're wrong, but they will take you to an internal arbitrator, to an ombud. You'll get rude emails sent to you. However, they've done nothing to protect themselves in terms of the construction contract. So these are just clever ways to look for defects, clever documents to look for, clever investigations to do, questions to ask. A clever contractor would have referred the dispute, would have referred the adjudication, and would be challenging the finding of a defect. And then, as a clever insurer, you stand back and say, well, you've challenged it. We're willing to help you there. Let's see what the outcome is. Because more often than not, an adjudicator or an arbitrator will hand down a ruling, whether it's a defect or a damage, or if it's a defect in something else. It's just something that you might want to play out in the long run. Right. So we're all up to speed with defects and what is defective. So I guess the next thing to look at and to consider is what is damage. Okay, again, the starting point, physical harm that impairs the value, usefulness, or normal function of something. The important words are the two words in the beginning, physical harm. Okay, look at the verb, to inflict physical harm. Okay, so as to impair its value, usefulness, or normal function. Okay, so damage requires, so let's look at this. Damage is any change in a thing, often a physical object, that degrades it away from its initial state. Importance, initial state, and it's a change in a thing. Okay. It can broadly be defined as changes introduced into a system that adversely affects its current or future performance. Okay. Okay, Rent-A-Car, Fridge, Mobile. The court adopted the ordinary meaning of the word damage in that damage required a physical alteration or change, not necessarily permanent or irreparable, which impairs the value or usefulness of the thing said to have been damaged. Now, what's important here is the damage doesn't need to be permanent and doesn't need to be irreparable. It's a physical alteration or change that impairs the value or usefulness of the thing. Okay. Very, very, very important. Okay. I've always loved this case. It's not a construction case, but it deals with food. And that's my second favorite thing in the whole world, other than the construction industry, is food. So we all need to eat, but I really enjoy eating. It's one of those like little, like solid life pleasures of mine. So This case actually deals with scallops. Scallops are delicious. So again, the case is one to read. And this deals with the transportation of scallops. They were being shipped to a wharf in Melbourne, Australia, and were destined for overseas export. However, during a routine inspection in Melbourne, the scallops were found to have been stored at a higher temperature than prescribed by the relevant export regulations. Whilst they could still have been eaten, but under Australian regulation, they could not be exported, and these were destined for exporting. Okay. The owner of the scallops argued that they were damaged by the fact that they could not be exported and claimed on their insurance policy. Okay, so it's the storage of a scallop at the wrong temperature. It changes the proteins or enzymes in the scallop. There's a fancy Australian regulation that says you can't export these anymore. They argue it's damaged. The court said that alteration in temperature had undeniably involved a physical change to a substance, and that change had the effect of removing one of the primary qualities which the scallops had, their exportability. A change in temperature in itself was a physical change, and the scallops were less valuable in the sense they could not be exported. Okay. So this decision provides some useful guidance as to what is a damage, and it really does. There seem to be two parts to this definition: a need for a physical alteration. The change in temperature was sufficient to satisfy that part of the test. So it's physical alteration. It's quite interesting because it's not just the change in the temperature of the scallop. It could also be the change in the enzymes, the protein composition, because that's what temperature does in an organic thing. The second part of the test, the damage must impair the value or usefulness of the property. In this, it's its exportability. So, very useful decision, a very cool decision, and it's one that sticks in your head because it's about scallops and they're delicious. Okay, so Bacardi Thomas Hardy packaging is the next one, and that deals with physical alteration. Okay, this is the manufacture and bottling of Bacardi breezes. As you can see, the food theme continues. I don't even know if they still make Bacardi breezes. When I was at high school, they were a thing. I don't even know if they're a thing anymore. Okay, so Thomas Hardy Packaging agreed to actually bottle these breezes. So it's take the liquid, put it in a bottle, put the branding, blah, blah, blah. One of the ingredients is carbon dioxide, and the packaging company bought that carbon dioxide from a third party. A batch of the carbon dioxide was contaminated with benzene, not something you really want in a drink, just putting it out there. The Court of Appeal decided that the addition of the contaminated carbon dioxide did not constitute damage. So very interesting. This is what the judge had to say. Although there were ingredients owned by Bacardi, which were separate from the defective carbon dioxide and water supplied by the bottling company, the bottling company's activity involved creating a new product by mixing it with all of these elements. The new product was not damaged, but merely defective at the moment of its creation. So again, the court takes a step back, looks at the test, and says, well, is it defective or is it damaged? This bottling company has agreed to bottle and mix the mixture that makes the Bacardi breezer. They buy a component of the mixture, being carbon dioxide, from a third party. The other components are water, and this is obviously a syrup of some sort that has alcohol in it. They should just sell that syrup with the alcohol, and I think that the world would be a better place. But anyway, and what this court says is, no, well, you're in the process of blending and mixing. One of those components is defective. It results in a defective batch or final component. It's not a damage, it's a defect. So there's a nice example as well. Okay. Parallels can be drawn between the Bacardi case, the claims for damage to the construction industry. For instance, the addition of an inappropriate admixture to concrete constitute damage, or the production of a defective concrete. On the Bacardi analysis, the addition of an appropriate admixture would presumably result in the production of a defective product rather than damage. Okay. Pilkington versus CGU Insurance. Like most insurance contracts, it required physical damage to property of another. Damage requires some altered state. It does not extend to a position where commodity supplied is installed in or juxtaposed with the property of a third party in circumstances where it does no physical harm, and the harmful effect of any other later defect or deterioration is contained within it. Makes sense to me. The useful effect of or any later defect or deterioration is contained within it. So it's an inherent element or characteristic of the thing. So let's go back to the Holmdene Brickworks example. The brick has something in it that causes it to decompose. That's not a damage. That's a defect. It is something inside the product itself. Okay. Pilkington is important. It rises out of the installation of heat-soaked toughened glass panels manufactured by Pilkington and installed in the roof and vertical paneling of the Eurostar station in Waterloo, London. An absolutely exquisite structure. If you've ever been, you'll agree. The glass panels were effectively manufactured and fractured after they were installed. Thankfully, no one was injured in the making of this speech. Pilkington claimed against its product liability insurance provided by CGU. The CGU cover provided liability for loss of a physical damage to physical property not belonging to the insured caused by any commodity, article, or thing supplied by the insured. The insurers rejected the claim. Ultimately, the insurance claim went to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal rejected the argument. It held that the incorporation of the defective glass itself cannot be considered to be damage to property. The insurance contract required physical damage to property of another. Okay. Now, why is that important? Because I am the supplier. I am covered for third-party damage and it has to be physical damage. Because the product I supply, for example, here, shatters upon installation, I haven't damaged someone else's property. The raise that I have supplied has failed and has exploded and damaged. Sure, it may have delayed them a little bit, and it may have there may be some cleanup costs with all the shattered glass all over the floor, but it's not a physical damage. And again, we've got to go back to policy wording. And too many times do I see people overlooking the word physical and the word damage. The words physical and damage. They are there. They are incredibly important to the cover provided. And that case takes us back to, don't forget those words. Critically important. Okay, Hunter versus Canary Wharf. The appeal court considered whether the deposit of dust could constitute damage for the purpose of a nuisance claim. Okay. In agreeing that deposits of excessive dust can be considered damage, this is what the court had to say. Reasonable conduct and a reasonable amount of cleaning to limit the effects of dust can be expected of householders. Subject to that, if, for example, in the ordinary use, the excessive deposit is trodden into the fabric of a carpet by householders in such a way as to lessen the value of the fabric, an action would lie. Similarly, if it follows from the effects of excessive dust on the fabric that professional cleaning of the fabric is reasonably required, the cost is actionable. So here is an example of how damage can occur over time, but then we have a wear and tear exception in our policies. So what I find interesting about this, and what I find very interesting about this, is why isn't that wear and tear? There is dust produced by a factory, which is Canary Wharf, that's why this comes from. The dust gets trodden onto my carpet, sure. Depending on how much dust, does it do damage, does it not do damage? But surely that's over time. Surely it's not a one-hit wonder, or is it a one-hit wonder? Does this happen because there's, for example, we have the Engen refinery in Durban. The Engen refinery explodes, a whole bunch of oil and dust gets shot into the air. There are apartment blocks that line the harbor. This smoke enters those apartment blocks. And now there is oils and dust that deposit on people's carpets. They walk onto those carpets and it then damages their carpets. There's a great example, and that is the example that follows this judgment. It's damage. The argument was, oh, but it's dust, it's wear and tear. No. But it had a specific source. It fell onto my carpet. It cannot be cleaned out, or it can be cleaned out. So there is an example of a damage that can occur. And one might say, oh, but it's expected. You left your windows open, soot and dust fly in, that's the norm. Well, what is the source and is it a damage? Again, it comes down to investigations, and you've got to look at the cause carefully. Promet is quoted widely when you're doing defects versus damages investigations, and it's actually quite interesting because you've got to look at damage versus defect, and the facts of this case are fascinating. Okay, it concerns a claim on an insurance policy relating to damage to an offshore accommodation platform which was built in Singapore. The platform had 3 legs which were designed to extend and retract so that the platform could be floated and towed into position. Okay. So it's basically a box that you tow out to sea. Its legs extend down to the seabed. The box gets jacked up. People live in this box. Think of an oil platform, an oil rig platform, something similar to that. Okay. At their base, the legs pass through a steel box, which is designed to sit on the sea floor when the platform was in position. Okay. Critically important. The steel box is called the spud can, which was strengthened by internal bulkheads and brackets and was designed to be watertight. The spud can was attached to the legs by welds. Okay. Fatigue cracking was discovered. The cracks were caused by the normal action of the waves. Okay. So what's critically important, and it's called saturation diving, these accommodation panel, or these special accommodation structures, the legs get put onto the seabed. Attached between the legs, there is this thing called a spud can, which is basically a pressurized vessel. The divers dive down, they live in the spud can, and it's designed to take a beating from the ocean, as you can imagine. It is very highly engineered. There's lots of steel design and steel work that goes into making these things safe and watertight. And then this spud can, this pressurized vessel, is then attached by welds to the steel structure. As you can imagine, these things get inspected from time to time for wear and tear, and they pick up that there is cracking along the welds. Okay. Why is that cracking there? As you can imagine, the sea is continuously moving. The sea has currents, the sea has forces, the sea has pressures. That's why building piers and doing anything offshore is incredibly difficult. And they find that due to that constant vibration and harmonics of the ocean, well, these welds have started to not be too happy and they've started cracking. Where else do we see this? A lot of you have probably answered in your head, the aviation industry, correct? Where you have fatigue cracking and you have fatigue failures. Very common because much like water, air has density and air has volume. So when that plane is shaking through the air, as it always is when you're in an airplane, those welds are often not happy. That's why inspections are important. So what does the judge say here? It would be an abuse of language to describe the legs and spud cans as merely defective. On an ordinary use of language, they were damaged. They were damaged by being subjected to stresses, which they were unable to resist due to the latent defects. This is to say the wrongly profiled welds. Okay, so the court there actually holds that it's damaged. And I've always found that to be quite interesting because when I look at this, I go, well, what has caused this damage? It is use out in the ocean. What is the damage? It's cracking to welds. Yes, the welds have been subjected to stresses, but isn't that wear and tear? It also comes down to age of the item. It comes down to how it's been used. But what is it designed to do? It's designed to be used offshore. It's designed to be used for accommodation in rough seas. The welds have cracked. Well, if the welds crack very early on in the structure's life, it would have to be an investigation into defect versus damage. Let's say that spud can and that accommodation structure are 15 years old and now they find welds being cracked. That's then wear and tear. It's a completely different investigation. So it's very interesting. And of course, the words latent defects are important because it's a defect that has only made itself known, become patent upon the happening of a thing. But what is the proximate cause of this loss? It's defective welds that have caused a damage. So for me, the exception on an insurance policy would apply, and you would be able to avoid cover for that reason. So this is an interesting judgment because it's two parties suing each other. But what's very interesting is how the judge talks about the defect and the damage, and how the judge describes them, and how they operate, and how they affect, and how the one occurs becomes patent, and how it causes damage. As I've said, these are multi-layered investigations. They are not simple, and there's no such thing as a straightforward defect versus damage investigation. They are highly technical. Quite an interesting case that comes up quite often is African products versus AIG. It's African products sought indemnification under a policy of insurance for financial loss it suffered after it had to shut down its mill for a period of time. And it's actually a case that looks at the wording of sudden and unforeseen, because remember, damage has to be sudden and unforeseen under certain policies. So it's not really a case on defect versus damage. It's a case on sudden and unforeseen, and how a court looks at that wording. However, what's very interesting in this judgment for this talk is the insulated wires that were installed under concrete slab. Now remember, all an insulated wire is, you'll have your copper or your metal element in the middle, and then it'll have rubber or a casing around it made of some other form of rubber or poly material. That makes it insulated. They're often underground because that's the way we do it in South Africa. They can deteriorate. The insulation, the packaging around the metal can deteriorate, and it can deteriorate. Underground, there's pressure, there's heat, there's chemicals, there's water, there's all sorts of things, and they can deteriorate. What happens is, over time, it deteriorated. Then the two copper elements or metal elements then touched, caused a short, caused a bang, spectacular fireworks display, because everything down line from that would have gone haywire or would have been severely damaged. So as you can imagine, there is damage. This damage exists. But now the question is it wear and tear? So is it over a long period of time, or was it sudden and unforeseen damage? Well, as you can imagine, the very big bang was sudden and unforeseen, but the court, quite correctly, then looks at what was it sudden and unforeseen. The court held that the word sudden and unforeseen in an insurance policy must be constructed to mean abrupt, occurring quickly, or taking place all at once. The damage was not sudden and unforeseen. Damage is contemplated in the policy. Had it not been for the gradual softening of the insulation, these conductors would not have been in contact with each other. The damage was therefore gradual softening of the insulation. And that was the damage. That was the proximate cause of what caused the short and caused the two wires to touch. So what I find interesting about this judgment is, number one, the interpretation of sudden and unforeseen, but number two is how the court looks into the detail of what resulted in the damage, and what is the actual damage, what was the peril that caused the loss. Well, it's the actual decay of the insulation. Okay, and that's it.
Thank you so much, David, for a very informative talk. We do have quite a few questions on the chat, but I think seeing as we are over a time a bit, we'll just send it through to you, and we'll send it to everybody that's attended. We'll send the responses to everybody that's attended. And we will send we'll put the recording up on our YouTube site for anybody that would like to go back, because there's people that had issues with load shedding. But thank you very much indeed, David, and we look forward to seeing you again in June.
Cool. And that's on the construction mafia.
Yes.
We are actually in court this week on 2 applications against them. So I'll be able to give you the latest on how the courts are dealing with them, and whether there's actually been any response from our government, because we've been bringing applications for 3 years now, and I'm yet to see any response. So we'll deal with that when I chat to you next time.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. And I hope that everybody that's joined us today will be able to join us. And thank you for everybody that's joined us on the Teams call as well. So thank you, and have a great day further, guys.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.